Have you ever trusted someone who, in the end, was just waiting for a chance to betray you? Now imagine if it were your own family. Even worse, what if you were the one being tested, without even realizing it? That's exactly what happened to Margaret. She was a millionaire, but she decided to pretend she was broke to see who really cared about her. The result? Her own relatives fell into the trap, trying to steal what she still had. But what they didn't know was that every word, every lie, and every scheme was being recorded. And when the truth came out, it was a shock that no one expected. Now, the big question: was Margaret wrong to test them? Or was it the only way to find out who truly deserved her trust? What happened next was even more unbelievable. And in the end, the punishment was worse than any court sentence. But what if you were in Margaret's shoes? What would you do? My rich aunt pretended to be poor and caught my parents in the worst crime. No one expected Aunt Margaret's fortune to evaporate like that. A woman who had always lived in luxury, suddenly living in a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town. That's what my mother said when she found out. My father, on the other hand, thought something was fishy. But money goes fast when mismanaged, and according to rumors, Margaret had lost everything in a scam. For the family, it was a shock. But for my parents, maybe it was an opportunity. The first visit to the trailer was uncomfortable. My mother brought a fruit basket, my father a rehearsed smile. Margaret looked exhausted, wearing old clothes and smelling of cheap coffee. "Life takes turns, doesn't it?" she said, sighing. My parents agreed with tears in their eyes. But inside, a calculation was being made. Who knows, maybe she still had some money saved. Who knows, in desperation, she would agree to sell some family heirloom. Or better yet, who knows if she would even survive long enough to need it all. It wasn't long before my mother suggested that Margaret sign some papers, just to guarantee security over the assets that still remained. Of course, only until she got back on her feet. Margaret smiled weakly and said she would think about it. That night, my father opened a bottle of wine and toasted with my mother, as if they had won a small prize. But the game was far from over. The next day, a lawyer called Margaret asking about suspicious activity in her name. Someone was trying to access accounts that, in theory, no longer existed. What my parents didn't know was that that trailer, that staged poverty, was a meticulously planned trap. Margaret wasn't broke. On the contrary, she was still a millionaire. But she wanted to know how far her own family's greed could go. And now, without them knowing, she was recording every meeting, every false phrase, every attempt at manipulation. While my mother offered to help sell some old jewels, Margaret just watched, like a hunter waiting for the right moment. The evidence piled up: forgery of signatures, attempted fraud, lies about Margaret's health to accelerate the transfer of assets. My parents didn't even suspect they were hanging themselves with their own greed. At the right moment, Margaret disappeared. No phone calls, no answers. A week later, lawyers appeared at my parents' door. They opened the paperwork and realized the size of the problem. It was a complete dossier on every attempt at deception. There was no escape. Margaret finally revealed her play. She called a family meeting and, in a cold voice, threw the evidence on the table. The shock was immediate. My mother collapsed on the sofa. My father tried to argue, but there were no arguments. The recordings spoke for themselves. And then came the sentence. Either they confessed everything and accepted the consequences, or Margaret would take the case to court. The family betrayal was complete. Now it remained to be seen whether there would be redemption or just destruction. But was Margaret exaggerating? What would you do in her place? Does a moral lesson justify this kind of trap? And above all, is greed really uncontrollable when the opportunity arises? Margaret always had an imposing presence. Maybe it was the way she spoke, paused, calculated, as if she was always 2 steps ahead. But when she returned to town, driving an old car and wearing clothes that didn't match her usual image, no one immediately recognized her. Rumors quickly arose. Bankruptcy, betrayal by partners, bad investments. In a few days, the whole family knew about the tragedy that had befallen the woman who, for years, had lived in mansions and 5-star hotels. The most curious thing? Margaret never confirmed or denied anything. She just sighed and said, "Things change." Her siblings were shocked, her nephews and nieces perplexed. But there was something different in my parents' eyes. A mixture of pity and interest. After all, if Margaret was really broke, what would happen to what was left of her fortune? And more importantly, was there still something that could be taken advantage of? It wasn't long before my mother suggested we visit her, as a kindness. The truth was that my parents never cared much for Margaret. But now, with her supposedly weakened, the dynamic seemed to have changed. The first visit was full of uncomfortable silences. Margaret lived in a small trailer, rented for a negligible price. The smell of reheated coffee and dust in the air contrasted with the memories we had of her at luxurious parties. My mother asked if she needed anything. Margaret smiled and said she was fine, but my mother insisted. "Are you sure? It must be difficult to start over like this." Margaret took a sip of coffee and looked at my father, who was analyzing the place with a look he was trying to disguise as concern. The real scheme began there. My parents started visiting Margaret regularly, offering help, giving advice on how to manage what little was left. The tone was always friendly, but the intentions not so much. One night, my mother brought paperwork saying they were just documents to facilitate the transfer of assets if something happened. She spoke as if she was helping Margaret, but anyone who looked closely would see that it was a plan. If Margaret signed, she would basically hand over everything she still owned, if there was anything left. What no one knew was that Margaret was 2 steps ahead. She saw the looks, the suggestions, the fake smiles. And in silence, she was designing her own trap. Recordings began to be made. Calls were monitored. Every time my mother mentioned the paperwork, Margaret responded with an innocent question, which made her reveal even more of her plans. Until one day, Margaret disappeared. 2 weeks later, lawyers appeared with complete dossiers, transcripts of conversations, videos, attempts at financial manipulation, and then came the final bombshell. Margaret was never broke. The trailer? A test. The story that she had lost everything? A trap. The woman that everyone thought was fragile and helpless was, in fact, exposing who her own family members really were. On the night everything was revealed, the silence in the room was heavy. My father, pale, tried to find a way out. My mother, with trembling hands, looked at the documents that proved her betrayal. And Margaret, she just watched them, with that look of someone who already knew how this would end. But should justice be carried out to the end? Or was there room for forgiveness? Now I ask, did Margaret exaggerate? Or did she do what anyone would do to protect themselves? If it were you, what would you do in her place? The silence was broken by my mother's accelerated breathing. She tried to say something, but the words seemed to choke in her throat. My father, who had always maintained a confident posture, was now slumped on the sofa, staring at the documents that denounced every attempt at manipulation. Margaret crossed her arms, waiting. She let the weight of the truth settle before speaking. "I always knew that greed destroys families. I just didn't imagine it would come from you." Her tone wasn't of anger, but of disappointment. And maybe that hurt even more. My father tried to argue. He said that everything was just a misunderstanding, that the intention was never to harm her. "We just wanted to help you manage what was left," he began. But Margaret laughed. Not a laugh of joy, but of those that expose the absurdity of the situation. "Help me? Signing documents that transferred my properties to you? How generous." My mother tried to intervene, saying that she would never have gone through with the plan, that it was just a precaution. But every excuse fell to the ground in the face of the evidence that Margaret had gathered. It was then that her lawyer intervened. There were 2 options: take the case to court and expose the attempted fraud, or resolve it in another way. But Margaret didn't seem willing to let it go so easily. She looked at them like someone evaluating a defendant about to receive their sentence. "You know, if it was just about the money, I could simply sweep this under the rug. But the problem is bigger. I needed to know who really cared about me." My father lowered his head. He knew there was no way to dispute that. Margaret stood up slowly and began to walk around the room, analyzing every detail, as if it were the first time she had set foot there. The funny thing is that when I really needed help in the past, no one offered me anything. Now that they thought I was vulnerable, they came up with contracts and generous advice. She made quotation marks in the air with her fingers. My father let out a heavy sigh. He understood what Margaret was doing. She didn't just want justice. She wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done. What bothered my mother the most was the humiliation. She couldn't bear the idea that Margaret had caught them in the trap, and now had the power to decide their fate. The shame was worse than any lawsuit. "What do you want?" she asked finally. Margaret stopped walking and looked directly at her. "Simple. I want you to prove that you are better than this. I want to see how far your remorse goes." The challenge was launched, but the question was, how to redeem a family betrayal. The answer didn't come immediately. My parents spent days in silence, trying to assimilate everything. My father, always so sure of his decisions, seemed lost. My mother, previously so determined, now avoided the mirror. The conscience weighs when one realizes that one's own greed has led us to the brink of collapse. But Margaret didn't just want an empty apology. If they were really sorry, they would need to prove it with actions. But what kind of redemption would be enough to erase a scheme like that? Margaret knew that, regardless of the outcome, nothing would be the same. Trust was destroyed, the family bond broken. But the question was, did she want revenge or redemption? Her desire for justice was greater than any blood tie. But would justice alone bring peace? Or would the real punishment be to let them live with the weight of their own conscience? Now I ask, if it were you, would you forgive? Or would you take the case to the ultimate consequences? And more importantly, is there redemption for this type of betrayal? The following days were a silent punishment for my parents. The humiliation of having been exposed corroded any trace of pride that still remained. The house, previously full of conversations and disguised plans, was now an emptiness of avoided looks and heavy silences. My father spent hours in the office, looking at papers that no longer had any meaning. My mother, always so meticulous with her appearance, now spent the day in a robe, without wanting to go out. Margaret didn't need courts to punish them. The shame was enough. But the question remained, what did Margaret really want? She didn't mention lawyers again, nor did she directly threaten to sue them. But her silence was worse. It left room for doubt, for the fear that at any moment a bailiff might knock on the door. It was a psychological game, and she was winning. Until, a week later, Margaret sent a short and direct message. We'll meet tomorrow. Decide if you prefer justice or redemption. The meeting took place in Margaret's old house, the mansion that, as far as everyone knew, no longer belonged to her. My parents arrived hesitantly, expecting to find lawyers or perhaps a film crew ready to expose their disgrace. But no, just Margaret sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands. She looked at them, evaluating their expressions. So? She asked, as if asking them to choose between two irreversible paths. My mother was the first to speak. Margaret, we were wrong. There's no excuse for what we did. My father, next to her, nodded but couldn't say anything. Margaret smiled wryly, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a test. She wanted to see if that remorse was real, or just despair. We're wrong? Yes, you were wrong. But the question that doesn't leave me in peace is, why? What made you think you had the right to deceive me? My father finally found his voice. Greed? Fear of losing opportunities? I don't know. But nothing justifies it. He took a deep breath. Margaret, I don't know what we can do to fix this. And that was the answer she was waiting for. There were no justifications. Just acceptance of one's own failure. Well, maybe there's something you can do. Margaret placed an envelope on the table. My parents exchanged glances before picking it up. Inside, a contract. But it wasn't a lawsuit. It was an agreement. Margaret wanted them to return everything. Not just the documents they tried to force, but anything they had acquired by dubious means throughout their lives. I want to know if you really understood the lesson. If you signed out of self-interest, then you learned nothing. But if you are able to give up out of genuine regret, then maybe there is redemption. The silence was dense. That decision wasn't just about money, it was about character. My parents had spent their lives accumulating, always with an eye on any chance of advantage. But now, Margaret was challenging them to do the opposite, to give up. What would they do? How far would they go to prove that they were not the people Margaret believed they were? And you? Do you believe they really changed? If you were in their place, would you sign this contract? Or would you try to get away unscathed, as you always have? My mother held the contract as if it were a death sentence. She read and reread each clause, looking for a hidden detail, a loophole, something that made it less real. My father, on the contrary, remained motionless, staring at Margaret. This is a test, isn't it? He asked. You want to see how far we can go? Margaret smiled wryly, a smile that revealed nothing. No? I want to know who you really are. The room was charged. Margaret's mansion, which used to be the scene of luxurious parties, now seemed like an invisible court where only looks weighed like evidence. If they signed, they would lose not only the chance to rob Margaret, but everything they had accumulated throughout their lives in a questionable way. If they refused, Margaret could take the case to court. Neither option was easy. But for the first time, the choice wasn't about money. It was about character. My mother took a deep breath and extended the pen. Her hand was shaking. For a second, it looked like she was going to sign. but then she stopped. Margaret, what if we do something different? What if, instead of that, we prove it in another way? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Another way? My mother looked at my father, seeking support. We were wrong, but we want to make up for it. Money isn't everything. We can use what we have to help others, to fix past mistakes. That was unexpected. Margaret watched carefully. Would it be a new manipulation? Or was my mother really willing to change? If you want reparation, maybe we should do something bigger. Margaret crossed her arms thoughtfully. Then tell me, what are you willing to do? My father, who always avoided showing weakness, finally seemed defeated. Whatever it takes. He said it with a choked voice. And at that moment, Margaret knew. They weren't pretending. The shame, the fall, the loss of their own reputation, all of this had made them see what really mattered. But would that be enough? The choice was in Margaret's hands, justice or forgiveness. And now I ask you, would you forgive? Or would you still take justice to the end? Margaret remained silent. The weight of that decision was greater than any fortune. Her eyes analyzed every detail on my parents' faces, looking for a sign of falsehood, a clue that that apparent redemption was just disguised despair. For years, she lived surrounded by people who saw her money before they saw her humanity. Now, before those who tried to betray her, she had the power to decide their fates, whatever it takes. My father's words echoed in the air. Margaret sighed and finally stood up. Very well. She took the contract, tore it into small pieces, and threw them in the fireplace. The fire consumed the pages slowly, as if it were digesting the past. If it is redemption that you want, it will not be on paper. It will be in practice. My parents exchanged glances, confused. Margaret continued. From now on, you will return everything. Not to me, but to those who really need it. She took another envelope from the drawer and handed it to them. It was a list of charitable organizations, social projects, people who had lost their homes to financial scams. The only way to prove that you have learned the lesson is by helping those you would never help before. My mother's expression was of pure shock. It wasn't just about losing money. It was about losing the illusion of control, about finally facing who they had become. My father didn't argue. He took the envelope and just nodded. For the first time in his life, there seemed to be no more resistance. They had lost everything. But perhaps for the first time, they were gaining something real. Margaret watched them for another moment before turning and leaving the room. She didn't want to hear empty promises. Either they would do what was right, or they would live with the shame of not having done so. Justice or redemption. In the end, she gave them the chance to choose their own destiny. And so, the story did not end with a court sentence or a public scandal. It ended with a new path, where the choices made from then on would be the real punishment, or the real salvation. Now, I ask you, did Margaret make the right decision? Would you forgive or take everything to justice? And more importantly, does anyone really change when they lose everything?
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.